So I want to take a look at something today that we have talked an awful lot about, and that's housing. And from a different perspective today, there is a new study talking about it, and this is a question I'm sure a lot of people have been asking themselves, the idea of renting versus buying. Does one particularly make sense or take precedence or should take precedence over the other? Well, there's a new study, new report, comparing the average rental and mortgage rates across the country to find out which option is more affordable. Although it's not a straight line, I don't think, to say. So let me begin by getting some input here from Carolyn Whitzman. She's a housing researcher at the University of Ottawa. I read some of your comments here, and I said this is not necessarily one of those questions that you can answer definitively and say yes or no, even depending on the market in the country. So what's the biggest issue here as far as you're concerned?
Well, the report compares little bit apples and onions. So it looks at costs of carrying a mortgage versus rent. One of the first things I'd say is that you need a down payment in order, let's say 20% in order to buy. And there's been some research by an organization called Generation Squeeze that says that in Montreal, it would take an average income earner 13 years to save up for a down payment. So ownership might not be viable for people, even if rents cost more than the mortgage costs.
You also mentioned, and I think people sometimes forget this, we've heard, of course, from millennials and Gen Zers about how difficult it is and almost impossible if they're looking into their future to even consider buying a home. You mentioned these rules, if you want to call them, they might have applied 30 or 40 years ago. They simply don't apply now, right?
Yeah, so going back a considerable amount, about 40 years, in the early 1980s, there's a measurement that's used, the average cost of a home divided by the average household income, and it was about 3-to-1 in the early 80s. So an affordable house was 3 times salary or annual household income. That's considered reasonable, affordable for, again, a middle income household. Now in Montreal, it's closer to 8 or 9 times area median income. In fact, that same report from Generation Squeeze says that housing would need to be a little over a third of the current price to be affordable to middle income households.
So now you're dealing with that. You're also dealing with a housing shortage. And even though the government has said, we understand there's a housing shortage, we're going to build more homes. How many, by your estimation, does that even begin to solve the problem, or could it?
Well, I mean, housing supply is a good long-term solution, particularly if it's well-located housing that's appropriate for families with children, for instance. And Montreal has a little bit of a leg up because it doesn't have the kind of exclusionary zoning policies. The policies have only allowed like single-family homes as opposed to small-scale apartments. So Montreal is better off than Toronto or Vancouver, and that's noticeable in terms of the rent. So until recently, Montreal had much more affordable rents. But now if you look at the average rent that's talked about in Zootopia, which is $1,995 a month, so nearly $2,000 a month for a 1 or 2 bedroom, not necessarily a family-sized home. The affordable rent for a middle-income person would be an absolute maximum of $1,600 a month. So that's over $300 gap between what would be affordable, again, for a middle-income family. We're not talking about low-income families and what's actually out there.
By the way, I will point out where Montreal might have a leg up, as you described it. There is so much red tape, and that's one of the things being discussed here on a regular basis. Trying to get anything done here, housing built here, I think that kind of levels the playing field with the rest of the country. It is very, very bad here, and it's one of those issues that keeps coming up. So I will bring that up. And I also want to ask you one other thing. Going back to this idea of the old rules, first of all, I wonder how many people listening to this interview are thinking to themselves, a 20% down payment? Not in a million years. Can't even conceive of that anymore. We were happy when they were saying, well, maybe you could get by with 10%. I'm wondering how realistic that even is.
Well, 20% was standard for most of the last 50, 60 years. There was a point where interest rates were very low and down payments were very small. That was kind of before the global financial crisis, and which was in 2008. And I think that most conventional finance these days is a lot more conservative. So absolutely, there's an entire generation of people who are locked out of home ownership at the moment. And although a lot of rental supply will help, for instance, making rents more reasonable, it's really going to take tackling some of the taxation systems that have made home ownership so out of reach for really virtually anyone under 45, I'd say. It's going to take that kind of systemic change, which we aren't really talking about in Canada yet.
So how do governments are obviously trying to face the problem and do something about it, but beyond building housing, to your point just now, how do we deal with this? What should we be doing? And I say we as a government here, what should we be looking at?
I mean, Canada in general, and certainly Quebec in particular, has a long, strong history of non-market housing where rents increase a lot more slowly and stay affordable a lot longer than they do for private development housing. So I'd say that one thing that the federal government can do with the government of Quebec is just fund a lot more non-market housing. That's certainly the only way to address homelessness and low-income housing need.
I will ask one other thing, interesting as well to note. So you suggest that, many people, and I think that's still the case for people now, maybe older people anyway, you buy a house as an investment, and the idea is when you decide to retire or downsize, you sell your house, you cash out, and you've made some money. But then you point out for that to work, and I'd never really thought of this, it's of course dependent on being able to find a lower cost of shelter wherever you're going to move to.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more wealthy countries in Canada, Germany, Austria, Denmark, I could go on, where it's a majority rental society. So the majority of households rent, and they have better pension systems. So Canada decided, and this was 50 years ago, that the main investment form for those lucky enough to buy a house would be cashing out on retirement. And at that time, the mortality rate for men was 70, for women a little under 75. Now for men it's 80, and for women it's 85. And that idea of cashing out and then renting isn't viable if you don't have accessible cheap rental nearby. So the whole model that the home ownership as retirement savings idea was built on is kind of broken.
Yeah, and of course, when you just take the logical extension then is, if that's the case and you could sell your house but not have enough to get into a rental unit, you end up staying in that home even longer, which reduces supply of homes to begin with. It seems like a vicious circle.
Oh, absolutely. The Statistics Canada, which puts out a lot of statistics, said in 2021 that the only age group where homeownership was growing was 85 or more years old. And that's one of the scariest statistics I've seen in a while.
Wow. Something to consider. I noticed, too, in the article, you have a son, I believe early 30s, who's in a rental now, who would like to be able to go home. What's that discussion like with him?
Oh, my goodness. It actually was going on today as well. I mean, fortunately, he lives in Ottawa. He has been able to be car-free and mortgage-free, but he's definitely going to have to buy a car because where he's renting is so far and so inaccessible by public transport to where he works. And we were talking about, what kind of debt are you going to take on? You can't get a car and a home at the same time. And it's unfortunate because, like any boomer, I want to see grandchildren, and that's not going to happen until there's secure housing.
Tough situation without an easy answer, I think, across the board. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Aaron. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.